I love horror stories, not the cheap, jump-scare-filled ones that only make you flinch for a moment before fading away, but the kind that linger long after you've finished reading. The ones that worm their way into your mind like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. They crawl under your skin, making you second-guess the creaks and cracks of your house, making you wonder if you're truly alone in the dark. So when my university announced a late-night study program at the old library, I signed up without a second thought. It wasn't just about needing a quiet place to study. I already had that. No, this was something else. The program offered an experience most people would never get. Access to the library from midnight until 4 a.m. In exchange, we'd receive a small scholarship. Just for staying up late and studying? It sounded too good to be true. Easy money. I only had to sit in a historic, dimly lit library and read horror books all night, which, truth be told, was something I already did for free. Getting paid for it felt almost laughable. But when I read through the details of the program, something caught my attention. A catch. Only a small group of students were allowed in each night, and there was a strict set of rules we had to follow. As I read them, excitement quickly turned into unease. These weren't ordinary library rules about being quiet or returning books on time. No, these were horror story rules. Rules that felt unnatural, rules that seemed to guard against something hidden in the dark corners of the library. I'd read enough creepy tales to recognize the pattern. These weren't about maintaining order or keeping us safe in the usual sense. They were there to protect us from something that lurked in the library's shadows. And if horror stories have taught me anything, it's that you always follow the rules. I read the library rules. You may only enter after midnight and must leave by 4 a.m. No exceptions. Check out a book before 12:30 a.m., even if you don't plan to read it. The library needs to know you're a guest. If you hear whispers from the aisles, do not try to find the source. Keep your head down and keep reading. The woman in the white dress sometimes appears on the second floor. Do not let her see you. If the lights flicker more than 3 times, close your book and leave immediately. At exactly 2:45 a.m., the library will go silent. Do not move until the sounds return. If you hear your name whispered but no one is around, leave your book and exit the building. Do not look back. Creepy, right? But I wasn't stupid. I took the rules seriously. And in hindsight, that's probably the only reason I made it through the night. I arrived at the library at exactly 11:55 p.m. The air outside was chilly, but as I stepped through the heavy wooden doors, a strange warmth seemed to envelop me, as though the building had been waiting for us. My backpack was packed with everything I might need. Notes, a few pens, a bottle of water, some snacks, and, just in case, a flashlight. The library was nearly empty. A few students sat scattered around, looking as tense as I felt. Ms. Dawson, the librarian, sat behind the desk. Her sharp eyes flicked up when I walked in, but she didn't speak. She was in her 50s, with iron gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her face set in a permanent frown. As I signed in, she simply nodded before going back to whatever she was reading. At exactly 12:10 a.m., I checked out a book. It was a horror anthology, a collection of unsettling short stories. It seemed fitting for the night, and maybe, in some twisted way, comforting. Ms. Dawson took the book, stamped it without a word, and slid it back to me. By 12:30 a.m., I had settled into a quiet corner on the first floor, away from the main study area but near a reading lamp so I wouldn't have to rely on the library's dim overhead lights. The place was silent except for the occasional rustling of pages and the soft scratching of pens on notebooks. For the first hour, everything felt normal, almost disappointingly so. I read a few pages, took notes, and got lost in the eerie stories. The atmosphere was heavy, sure, but nothing happened. The library was just a library. But then, at 1:15 a.m., the whispers began. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A soft murmur, barely audible, drifting between the bookshelves. A trick of my tired brain. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. A voice. Low. Faint. Like someone was standing just beyond the rows of books, whispering into the darkness. I kept my head down and kept reading, because I had followed the rules, and I wasn't about to stop now. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, slipping through the old wooden shelves, winding through narrow aisles like a breath in an ancient tomb. But then it hit me, there was no wind inside the library. The windows were shut tight, and the massive doors hadn't opened since I walked in. The voices weren't coming from the building. They were coming from the darkness. At first, it was barely audible, like a secret whisper just out of reach. I gripped my book tighter, my fingers digging into the worn pages. Rule number 3. If you hear whispers from the aisles, do not try to find the source. Keep your head down and keep reading. So I did. I forced myself to focus on the words in front of me, even though they blurred together into an unreadable mess. My breathing felt too loud. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the whispers, but only for a moment, because they were getting louder. What had started as a faint murmur now sounded like a full-blown conversation. Just out of reach, just beyond the shelves. The voices overlapped, urgent and insistent, and then a pause. A moment of suffocating silence before I heard my name. Not from the whispers, from upstairs. My stomach dropped. Rule number 7. If you hear your name whispered but no one is around, leave your book and exit the building. Do not look back. Every muscle in my body froze. The air thickened, suffocating, as if the library itself was holding its breath. I carefully set my book down, my hands trembling, slow and deliberate. I wasn't going to be the idiot in a horror movie who ignored the warning signs. I had followed the rules. I had done everything right. And now I was getting out. With slow steps, I grabbed my bag and turned toward the exit. And that's when I saw her. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, half hidden in the shadows of the second floor. The woman in the white dress. Her gown was old-fashioned, like something from a century-old photograph, draping around her like she had just stepped out of another time. Her long black hair spilled over her face, a curtain hiding whatever lay beneath. She didn't move, she didn't breathe, and she was blocking the only way out. My throat went dry. Rule number 4. The woman in the white dress sometimes appears on the second floor. Do not let her see you. I forced myself to stay still, my heart hammering in my chest. Maybe she hadn't noticed me yet. Maybe if I backed up slowly, I could slip into the shadows before she saw me. Before I could even finish the thought, her head snapped up. A jerking motion, unnatural and wrong, as if something invisible had yanked her gaze toward me. I saw her face for a split second before instinct took over, and I ran. Her eyes were empty, black voids where they should have been. And her mouth was too wide, stretched into an unnatural grin, as if her skin had been pulled and torn to make room for something that shouldn't exist. And she saw me. I didn't stop running until I was back at my seat. My legs felt weak, my lungs burning, but I didn't care. I collapsed into my chair, gripping the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. I pulled my hoodie up, sinking into its fabric like it might shield me from whatever had just happened. My breathing was uneven, but I forced myself to stay silent. If I made a sound, if I moved too much, would she come back? I had followed the rules, and something still saw me. A cold dread settled deep in my chest, heavier than before. I clenched my jaw, trying to focus on the only thing grounding me. The slow, steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Every second felt like it stretched on forever, as if time was hesitating, unsure whether to move forward. The minutes dragged on. Then, at exactly 2:45 a.m., everything changed. The library went silent. Not the normal silence. Not the quiet of an empty room or a late-night study session. This was wrong. It felt like the entire building had been swallowed by a vacuum. The low hum of the lights vanished. The faint creaks of wooden shelves, the rustle of paper, gone. Even the ticking of the clock, the only thing that kept me grounded, stopped. I held my breath. Even my breathing felt muffled, as if the silence was pressing down on my lungs, choking every sound before it could escape. I remembered rule number 6. At exactly 2:45 a.m., the library will go silent. Do not move until the sounds return. So I stayed perfectly still. Seconds dragged into minutes. Or maybe it was my mind playing tricks. It was hard to tell how much time had passed. The stillness felt endless, suffocating, wrapping around me like a living thing. Then, a sound. Not a whisper, not a footstep. Something dragging across the floor. Slow, deliberate, a dull scraping noise, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. My body went rigid. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't distant. It was coming from the second floor. Do not move. Do not move. Do not move. The words repeated in my head like a desperate prayer. The dragging continued, slow and methodical, growing closer, creeping down the unseen aisles above me. And then, the staircase. The dragging sound shifted, becoming heavier, louder. It was descending. I clenched my fists so tight my nails dug into my palms, the sharp pain barely registering over the fear flooding my body. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I stayed still. It reached the first floor. The dragging sound was behind me now, so close. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body screaming to run, to bolt for the door and never look back. But I couldn't. I knew I couldn't. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just the suffocating silence. Then, a voice, right against my ear. "I see you." Cold breath brushed my skin, sending a violent shiver down my spine. My mind barely had time to process the words before the sound returned. The ticking clock, the rustling pages, the distant hum of the lights. The world came back to life, as if it had suddenly remembered it was supposed to exist. The silence vanished, replaced by the familiar sounds of the library, ordinary human sounds. I gasped, sucking in air like I had been underwater. My whole body trembled, my hands slick with sweat, my pulse pounding so hard it hurt. The whisper still lingered in my mind, burned into my memory like a scar. I had followed the rules. I had done everything right. And yet, something still saw me. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what would happen next. Forget 4 a.m. Forget the scholarship. Forget everything. I grabbed my bag, hands shaking, fumbling with the straps. My chair scraped loudly against the floor as I stood. But I didn't care. I left the book behind, no time to return it, no time to think. I ran, through the rows of books, past the grand staircase, never looking back. I expected to hear footsteps behind me, to feel a cold hand grab my wrist before I reached the door, but nothing happened. I burst into the night air, heart still racing, breath coming in ragged gulps. The campus was still, as if the world outside had no idea what I had just been through. But I knew, and I wasn't coming back. At least that's what I told myself. The next evening, I found myself standing at the library doors again. I hadn't planned to return. Every rational part of me told me to stay away, but something pulled me back. Curiosity, fear, or maybe just the need to understand what had happened. Ms. Dawson was at the front desk, as always. She didn't ask why I left early. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just looked at me, her sharp eyes scanning my face like she was looking for something. Some sign that I knew. "You followed the rules," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a fact. I swallowed hard and nodded. She sighed, as if she had expected me to fail. Then, without a word, she slid a new copy of the rule sheet across the counter. "Good," she said quietly. "But next time," she tapped the paper, "sit closer to the exit.